In this exercise, we're going to focus on displaying our links horizontally. And since there are multiple ways to build a horizontal menu, I'm going to demo a couple of techniques that allow us to do that, talk about some of the issues surrounding them, and then discuss what my preferred technique is. To do that, I'm working on the horizontal.html file, this time from the 04_02 directory, but we're just sort of picking up right where we left off. Again, first order of business is to get those links displaying horizontally rather than vertically, which is the default. Now, the key to this is the list item element itself. List items, by default, are displayed in browsers as block level elements. Now, what that means is that these elements are stacked one on top of another, which is why they're displayed vertically. In order to get them to display horizontally, we need to sort of change that some way. So the first technique I'm going to show you guys is to change the display property. So just below the existing selector here, I'm just going to do a selector that targets the list items, so the LI. And I'm going to go up and I'm going to change the LI to display inline. Rather than having the browser display it as a block level element, I'm telling the browser that from now on, for these particular list items, it needs to display them as inline level elements. Let's take a look at that in the browser and see the result. Now, rather than stacking one on top of each other, because these are inline level elements, they're displaying all on one single line, and they'll keep doing that for as long as they have room. Problem solved, right? Well, there's always problems regardless of the technique that you're using, and I want to show you what the problems are here when we start using inline level list items. I've clicked on the page. I'm just going to start tabbing through these links. As I tab through the links, notice how the links are highlighting. The only active area of the link is, of course, shrink wrapped right to the content. Now, we're used to that, right? In the past, when we were creating our vertical menus, one of the first things that we did was take our anchor elements and change their display to block. And that's going to be the instinctive reaction as to what the next step would be here. Let me show you what happens when you do that. If I go down into my styles and create another selector that's going to target the links inside that list, let's just say I changed the display to block and then give it a width and a height so you can make sure you can see it. We'll do height of 50 pixels as well. I'm going to do a background color of red. This would be a normal step. Now I've got them all displayed horizontally. I'll display the links as block level elements so that I can start controlling width, height, padding, margin, things like that. All right, so let's see what happens. When I refresh my page, we just told the browser that the links themselves should display as block level elements. What do block level elements do? They stack one on top of the other. And so because of that, even though we've displayed the list items as inline level elements, now all of a sudden, the links are going right back to displaying as block level elements. If we want to control those things like padding and margins and things like that within our links, they need to actually display as block level elements. So are we sunk? Well, we're not necessarily sunk. If I come back into my list items and I change their display to what's known as inline block, if I save that and refresh, you can see that now they stack right back on top of each other. So what in the world's going on there? Well, inline block is a display property that not a lot of people use, but it's very, very handy. Essentially what it does is it tells the browser that I want this particular element to display as an inline level element, but I want to be allowed to set block level properties on it, like margins and paddings and things like that. So now the block level elements are sitting inside of them the same way they would if the list items were still block levels. I know it's hard to wrap your head around that. Just trust me that this works. You could have also gone in and applied the inline block to the anchor elements as well, and that would have worked. The only problem with this particular technique in using inline block is that on older versions of Internet Explorer, inline block is only allowed on elements that should display as inline as default. So there are a lot of things that you need to think about there. This is one way to tackle that particular technique. And as you're probably guessing, it's not my favorite. Let me show you what my favorite technique would be. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of this list item selector altogether, and I'm going to go back up to my UL, LI, and just underneath list style, I'm going to go ahead and add float of left. This time, instead of using display inline to display the links horizontally, I'm floating them to the left. Now, if I save this and go back and preview this in my browser, I can see that now all the links are still displaying horizontally. I don't have any spacing between them now, and that's because I don't have any default margins or padding between them. But they're all displaying exactly the way I want them to in terms of being horizontal to that. That doesn't mean that floats are without their problems. Containing floats is difficult. Often the parent container elements will collapse on themselves. We're going to take a look at how to deal with that in just a little bit. And floated elements can often sort of mess up the layout that comes after them. So a lot of times you have to clear those floats as well. So both of these techniques can have their pros and cons. The way I look at it is like this. Display inline is perfect if you don't really need to control the exact width, height, and box model properties of the links inside the horizontal menu. If that's the case, display inline works fantastic. On the other hand, if you do need that control, then the float method is probably the better method to use, but just be aware that you have to deal with some of the peculiarities of the float method as well. There you have it. Those are two techniques that give you almost exactly the same results. My personal preference is floating my horizontal menu elements as opposed to using the inline methods, and that's simply because I really like to have more control over the formatting of the individual link items. Knowing how both of these methods work is really important so that you can use your own judgment about which one that you prefer and which one is right for a given situation.